started getting texts and calls. My sister-in-law called me or texted me on Friday and said she was sitting in her back porch drinking coffee, watching it rain, and listening to me. Mom even, I talked to my mother today, and she even commented on some things. And I'm going, wow. I knew that this was a popular format, but that's good. All right. Well, the time was about like it is today. It was the mid-1970s, and we were coming unto the bicentennial, just as we are coming into our 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And bicentennial, easy to say. And even when Texas had their 150th, it was a sesquicentennial. But however you say what we are now, I just like it, we're calling it the 250th. That's a lot easier. But anyway, the time was about the same. A lot of America was asking questions about their heritage. And how did we get here? And if for those of you who remember the mid-1970s, Vietnam was just winding down. There were a lot of protests going on in the country. It was not one of these real smooth times in American history. But it seemed like as we were coming toward the 200th anniversary that not only were Americans coming together for that celebration, but there was a lot of questions being asked about our heritage. And so I'd like to pick up with that and give you a little taste of what it was like in the mid-1970s. Night had fallen on a small New England harbor, and the fishing boats rocked gently at anchor. Inside the nearby chapel, a gathering of some 200 people. So we only need about another 180. But the gathering of some 200 people was illuminated by electric candles which glowed softly against wood paneling. The speaker came quickly to the heart of the message. This nation was founded by God with a special calling. The people who first came here knew that they were being led by the Lord Jesus Christ to found a nation where men, women, and children were to live in obedience to Him. This was truly to be one nation under God. The reason, I believe, that we Americans are in such trouble today is that we have forgotten this. We've rejected it. In fact, we've become quite cynical about it. We as a people have thrown away our Christian heritage. I think we could say that today, 50 years later from when this was written. I don't think much has changed on more of the positive side of that. But I do want to read you what Christopher Columbus himself said about why he came here. And this is from an obscure volume of Columbus's, which had never previously appeared in English. Now remember, this is the mid-1970s, and in the year 1971, a publication called the Presbyterian Layman had published for the first time in English these writings of Christopher Columbus. And on this night, in the mid-1970s, these people were hearing it for the first time. Now, what's really interesting, I went in and did a Google search on this exact writings of Christopher Columbus. You can now buy in English on Amazon the whole works. So I thought there has been some changes in the last 50 years. But this is what Columbus wrote. It was the Lord who put into my mind, I could feel His hand upon me, the fact that it would be possible to sail from here to the Indies. All who heard of my project rejected it with laughter, ridiculing me. There is no question that the inspiration was from the Holy Spirit. because he comforted me with rays of marvelous inspiration from the Holy Scriptures. I am a most unworthy sinner, but I have cried out to the Lord for grace and mercy, and they have covered me completely. I have found the sweetest consolation since I made it my whole purpose to enjoy his marvelous presence. For the execution of the journey to the Indies, I did not make use of intelligence, mathematics, or maps. It is simply the fulfillment of what Isaiah had prophesied. No one should fear to undertake any task in the name of our Savior, if it is just and if the intention is purely for his holy service. The working out of things has been assigned to each person by our Lord, but it all happens according to his sovereign will, even though he gives advice. He lacks nothing, that is, in the power of men to give. Oh, what a gracious Lord, who desires that people should perform for him those things for which he holds himself responsible. Day and night, moment by moment, everyone should express their most devoted gratitude to him. That stunned a lot of people that evening when Peter Marshall read that. I know that today there has been an attempt, and maybe successful attempt in many places, to begin to rewrite American history and Christopher Columbus's role in that. But these were his words that were written in the early 1500s. So that's when this was written. And just once again, to kind of reset from last week, I talked about the printing press in the mid-1400s when it came out. Christopher Columbus, as we know, 1490s, he made about 4 or 5 trips over to North America into the early 1500s. And this is in the time between that printing press and the Reformation. So when he's writing this, the Protestant Reformation has not taken place yet. So just to kind of set that in to history. I was also reminded last week, I talked about how as these various groups of Protestants came across, that they came and they experienced religious freedom when they got here. That is all true. But I was asked to emphasize what they also left and not to forget that they were leaving persecution. So they accomplished 2 things. They were escaping persecution, but they also found liberty to worship. So that's a quick review from last week. So let's jump into today. I briefly answered this question last week, but the question is, what happened to the Puritans? They came across, they set up their towns, their communities. They built it around the church. They wanted to live in a place where their Christian faith was not just something they did on Sunday mornings, but it was a part of their everyday life, including their government, how they governed each other. So what happened? Most people believe that have studied this, that they became prosperous and they became increasingly self-reliant. This is where the word Yankee comes from. This very self-reliant individual that can take care of themselves. So within a couple of generations, they had become incredibly prosperous. Now let's also reset who these Puritans were. They were not the nobility. They were not the successful business owners, agrarians, whatever they were doing. They were not the owners of businesses that were coming from England. They were the working class on down. They got to the colonies, which, we've come to the United States. They got to the colonies. They put themselves to hard work, God's favor, a lot of natural resources, and within just a couple of generations, achieved a level of prosperity that they could not have dreamed that they would have ever had back in England. And we've seen that in our own time of what prosperity can do to people. Prosperity changes people. And you go from relying on the Lord to saying, I can do this myself. It's happened time after time. It happened then. It's happened today. So that's what happened to the Puritans. Now, there's still a congregational church in New England, and that is the church descendants of that movement. But it's a very small, very regional denomination. But it didn't stay that way long. In the 1730s, there was a pastor in Northampton, Massachusetts, out pretty close to Cape Cod. His name was Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was considered the brightest, most respected theologian of the day. He was educated, and he had all the credentials of the day. He was brilliant, but he was not that good of a preacher. He was very reserved. His delivery was dry. His delivery was monotone. And he seemed to just focus on the back wall when he preached. I say that to set this up. This was the beginning of what has become known as the Great Awakening. He felt stirred, and he started preaching more boldly in the 1730s. He started challenging his congregation. And suddenly, little pinpricks of light started within his congregation. There are stories of people coming to him that were not regular attenders of his services, that were known for some of the rougher sides of town. People that would hang out in the taverns and partake of what was available in these taverns, and they were coming to him. He would pray with them, and they would come. They would give their life to Jesus Christ at that time, and they would do it in a very boisterous way. Historians think it was really advantageous that it happened to someone like Jonathan Edwards in his presence. Someone that was a distinguished theologian, that was not ever accused of manufacturing any kind of emotional outpouring. And suddenly, through his sermons and his presentations, people were starting to come to Christ like they hadn't in a generation or two. And that is generally considered the beginning of the Great Awakening in the early 1730s. But then along comes a man from Britain, a man named George Whitefield. George Whitefield was a contemporary of John and Charles Wesley. And in fact, the Wesleys had started a holy club. And they had brought Whitefield into their club. And it was through this association and through several months of worship with them and study with them that George Whitefield felt the call to start preaching. And he started preaching to the coal miners and others in England. He gave one sermon that we know of, actually in a church like we're sitting here today. And he was so animated and so passionate in his presentation and so challenging in his message that the church kicked him out and said the Church of England said you could never preach again indoors. And that's why he went outdoors. He arrives in Philadelphia. Now, who is this George Whitefield? I'm going to try to paint a picture for you. Think of the passion and sincerity of Billy Graham in his crusades. And then lay over that the charisma of someone like Joel Osteen. And you've got this highly charismatic person that's incredibly passionate and incredibly solid in his preaching. And he starts preaching mainly outdoors. He has become an outdoors person. And he starts in Philadelphia. And over his lifetime of the next 35 years, he is going to impact these colonies from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to Savannah, Georgia. He's going to preach in every large town of the day, which is mainly along the East Coast. That's mainly where all the population was. He preached probably the same sermon 1,000 times. And that sermon was, you need Jesus Christ to be your Lord and Savior. You need to give your life to Jesus Christ. You need to walk with Jesus Christ. And that should be the center of your life. He preached that sermon over and over and over to thousands and thousands of people. And the dam broke. And people, like I say, from New Hampshire to Georgia accepted Christ by the thousands. It was a Acts 2 kind of experience for the colonies. And this went on for about 30 years. It's also really critical in the time it took place, because now you know he died in 1770. So he's preaching from 1735 about to 1770. And we know what's going on now in American history. This is the leading up to the Revolution. So you have what's going to become an entire nation that's given their life to Christ. At the same time, a nation is being formed. And that's where the Christian nation that we now are a part of, he was as important in the foundation of this country as Paul Revere on his ride, Sam Adams in Boston, all the people that have become a part of the lore of American history. George Whitefield is as important a player in that as any of these other people. That was the Great Awakening. It cannot be overstated how important his message was and the timing of it and the breadth of who heard it. It was the beginning of the stitching of the fabric that became our country. Now, that's what's going on at that level. Let's spend some time now talking about the people who are hearing this message. We've talked about the Puritans. I think we got a pretty good handle on them. They came from England. They're not the upper class at all. And they have now become prosperous Yankees up in New England. We talked about the Quakers last week. They've settled in Pennsylvania. We talked a little bit about some oppressed Catholics that came. They've settled mainly in the Maryland area. We did not talk much about the rich people who came. There were not many rich people who came to the colonies in the 1700s. Now think about this. You're in English society. You have position. You own a business. You have wealth. You have generational wealth. You're not leaving that. Those people that are in that situation, they're staying in England. But let's talk about this, the third son of a half-rate earl. Let's say there's an earl of, Sandwich or somewhere over in England. And he doesn't have the biggest estate. He doesn't have the nicest manor house. Got some land. It's not the best land. It's not close to England, but it's not too far. And let's say you're the third son. Well, the first son's going to inherit the place of whatever it is. Well, a lot of the times the first sons either die or they're not that good or whatever. So the second son is always hanging around thinking that something might happen to the first son, and they'll be the one that gets the family estate. By the time you get to the third son, you don't have much luck. So what are you going to do? They decide, well, let's go try out these colonies over in the U.S. And where this class of people typically have settled is in what's called the Tidewater area of Virginia. That's where D.C. is today. It's where George Washington and some of our other founding fathers, the Virginians at the Declaration of Independence and later at the Constitution Convention. These Tidewater Virginians. They were not extremely wealthy, but they were more upper class than most who came to the colonies. They brought the Church of England with them. The Church of England did not come first. The Church of England kind of culturally came with them. They were not a very evangelical people at all. And so that's the group there. We talked about the Huguenots from France. They settled more in the south, in the Georgia, South Carolina area. So you've got these pockets of people. So we got some English Puritans, we got some English nobility, we've got some Central European Quakers, we've got some Dutch Reformed. Can't forget the Dutch Reformed. They're in the Manhattan area of what will become New York. It was New Amsterdam at the time. We got some French down in the South Carolina, Georgia area. But we're about to have the biggest wave of migration the country ever saw. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Scotch-Irish. I think most of you have probably heard that term. It may be something that's a part of your family. My guess is that half of the people here this evening, those of you watching online, easily half of you have a Scotch-Irish heritage. Who were these people? Well, real quickly, for those of you who have watched Braveheart, William Wallace, the King Bruce, that was around plus or minus around 1200. That's when that time setting was. That was the last real government in Scotland for about 400 years. So think about a people that have not had any form of central government for about 400 years. How tribal these people would be. So we get to around The year now is 1600. Scotland is divided geographically into two areas. There's the lowlands and there's the highlands. So it's a geographical distinction, but it also becomes a very significant line of demarcation between those two groups of people. The lowlanders, which are in southern Scotland, which abuts England, the land is not that great there. It's not good for growing many crops. It's not really great for animals, sheep, goats, cattle, things like that. It'll sustain a little bit of land, but not a lot. The land was owned by some real ruffian kind of nobility. They were not an educated nobility. They weren't really wealthy at all. They just seemed, through passing of ownership of land through time, kind of were in control of this lowland area. It was also the area that whenever the English were trying to come up and really become the government of Scotland, this is where the wars were fought. So you're out there trying to either scratch out a living through crops, through livestock, or every once in a while having to run to the hills because the English are coming. So this is the lowlands of Scotland. And then you get back into the highlands, and nobody went up there. I mean, you talk about an ungovernable group of people. That were the Highlander Scots. Last week, I introduced a character named John Knox. Well, John Knox is from the Church of England. He's a pastor. And through various things that happen over time, he winds up moving up into Scotland and becomes a part of this regional thing called the Church of Scotland. He is heavily influenced, and we talked about Calvin last week, he's heavily influenced by John Calvin. And he becomes a part of a follower of John Calvin, and then so he starts preaching a doctrine of Calvinism to the people of Scotland. Now, he's both lowland Scotland and highland Scotland. He's got the whole area. He becomes very popular. Part of his preaching is he's telling the Scots that each individual person has worth. That was one of the things that he preached. He's one of the first clergy to go out and tell each person they are a person of worth. Now, the Scots, whenever the English have been trying to conquer them, they've always been fighting them, and now they've got this guy that's saying that they themselves are of worth. And that resonates with them. He also introduces a form of the very, very earliest of what would become known as public education. The Scots, for the most part, no one knew how to read up there. No one could read. And he was such a Protestant reformer that he insisted that the population learns to read, and the number one book that they need to read is the Bible. And as he teaches the people to read, and they start reading the Bible, a real fervor for Christianity just breaks out in Scotland. And he gathers them all in, And he starts setting up these churches all through Scotland. And he lets the people in the church make decisions. He's not one that he wants to dominate the governance of the churches. And because of this, he just becomes adored. He's given them worth. He's given them voice. The people now get to make decisions that they've never been able to make before. And within one generation, the Scots go from being completely illiterate to understanding the Bible in their own language and for themselves. One of the quickest transformations of a group of people that history has seen in this way. So the Scots now have just embraced this, and this becomes the beginning of the Presbyterian movement that we're going to know. All right. So let's go back to some of these English middling kind of nobility. As we come into the 1700s, the English have been trying to dominate Ireland. So we've got the Scots, now we've got to get the Irish component to this. So the English have been trying to dominate Ireland. They've set up a government in Dublin, but they just are not winning the hearts and souls of the people, the Irish people at all. And by the time you get up into the northern part of Ireland, an area called Ulster, today it's called North Ireland, but if you've ever followed what's gone on in Northern Ireland in our lifetime, you'll from time to time hear the name Ulster. That's the same region. Well, Ulster was very lightly populated. It's in the far north of Ireland. And as you get north, the growing season's less. Everything about moving north in the northern hemisphere is going to restrict the productivity of the land. So there wasn't many people living up there. But the English, they had already set up these colonies in North America. And they go, we can do this in Ulster. And we've got all of this middling nobility that don't have land. What if we gave them some land and set them up in Ulster? And then it came up with a term, plantation. Plantation was created by the English, and what they would do is they would give large tracts of land to this nobility back in England and say, this is your land. We're out of land in England, but we can give you some land up here. Now, if you know your geography, the western side of Scotland and the eastern side of the northern part of Ireland are only separated by a couple small islands. You can actually stand in Ireland and look in Scotland. It's that close. So, what do nobility need to work land? They need people. And so, there were some other things going on in Scotland politically and things of that nature we don't need to get into, but there was a real urgency on the part of these lowlanders, not the Highlanders, but the lowlanders, Scotland, to let's move. And all they have to do is literally move less than 10 miles in some places, just across the water. So you have the English plantations that get set up in Ulster, and you've got this labor force over here in Scotland. And the king, what the king is trying to do, he's trying to get people to have allegiance to him. And so if he says, if I can bring these Scots over to Ireland, improve their life, maybe they'll give me the credit for doing that, and then I can spread my rule over another group of people. That worked for about a generation. And then it seems like things just fall apart after a while. And so what was happening in North Ireland, in this Ulster area, was again very similar to what had been happening over in Scotland. So the year is 1717. And one of these Scots that are now living in Ireland, he hears about this wonderful place called North America, these colonies. He hears about a place called Pennsylvania. He hears about this is the opportunity that you've really been looking for. If you thought that Ulster was an upgrade from Scotland, this area called Pennsylvania is the promised land. So, like what happens a lot of times, a couple of guys got on a boat that was headed to Philadelphia, and they went across to see if it was really true. And it was. They came back to Ulster and said, let's go. We don't need to worry about the English anymore. We don't need to worry about any of this. There is more land than you can imagine, and it is the promised land. And that was the beginning of a wave that would go on until the early 1800s. It peaked out, once again, about 1770. So you have these Scotch-Irish that are just flooding into the colonies. They're coming in through Philadelphia primarily. There are other ports. Some of them move into Boston area. There's some that go into the New York area. Wherever there's a big port, wherever there's transportation between England, Ireland, and the colonies. But primarily, they are going into Philadelphia. And their pastors are coming with them. Their Presbyterian pastors are coming with them. They're on the boats with them. And we're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands are coming. Tens of thousands every year for years. At one point in time, the Scotch-Irish comprised about 25% of the country's population. This wave. Now, think about who these people are. They have no wealth. They've been marginalized, not just for generations, but for centuries. And they suddenly now have their freedom. They have no overlords. And they respond with a fervor that would carry on for generations. So they pour into Philadelphia. And one of my sources here is called the Great Wagon Road. It was a road that came out of Philadelphia and it went west to about the center part of Pennsylvania, to where the Allegheny Mountains are. It went over a pass through that little neck of Maryland, if you know your geography, and they spilled into the Shenandoah Valley. And from there, the Shenandoah Valley runs for well over 100 miles. And as these settlers came through, they would build a town, they'd get their farms going, the next wave would come, and they would just keep pushing down, until they got to an area in the very southern part of Virginia. They were following the trails of Native American roads called traces. You may have heard that term before. And so they were following these, like pre-existing interstate highways. The southern Indians would be trading with the northern Indians of the New England area, and they'd be going back and forth through this area. And it was a heavily traversed, there were good trails, And so here come these Scotch-Irish. They're just pouring in here. But when you get into southern Virginia, the trail branches. One goes toward the coast, over toward Charleston, South Carolina. And another, the western fork, goes to what we now know as the Cumberland Gap. The Cumberland Gap, where Virginia and Tennessee, North Carolina and Kentucky pretty much all come together. And it's through that gap that settlers will then go into what will become the state of Kentucky after the Revolution. So this is where these Scotch-Irish are coming. And they're bringing their Presbyterian religion, their Presbyterian faith with them. And there are Presbyterian pastors now being set up all through here. And unlike where I started with Jonathan Edwards, these Presbyterian pastors were just dynamite of men. I mean, they would preach a very Calvinistic doctrine. Basically, is to, every Sunday save you from hell so that you can go to heaven. It was a heaven and hell kind of sermons that they would preach, but it resonated so much with these Scotch-Irish that they were just very fervent in their fervent in their practice of their Christianity. And so that is what is setting up. So this is the first group of people that have really penetrated the coastal area. And now they're in the western side, central to western side of Virginia, and they're starting to make their way down through North Carolina and into South Carolina, or starting to make their way over toward what will become Kentucky. So we're in 1770. So now we know what's about to happen. We're about to have a revolution. We all have had that form of history, so we know that. So what happened on the Christian side of this? What happened on the church side of this? Well, we had a war, and the colonies win. The Church of England is still the official church. Although there's all these other denominations that I've been talking about, they've had the freedom to be who they want to be. But at the same time, this is an English government that's over in charge of them. There's King George. And so with him sitting as the leader of the Church of England, the official church of the colonies at the time of the Revolution is the Church of England. Its deepest penetration is in Virginia. And Virginia becomes one of the most important colonies of the formation of what would become the United States. So you got the Church of England here in Virginia, other places up and down the coast. There are congregations all up and down the coast. So we win. Our side wins. All of the British then go back to England. That means the pastors, all of the Church of England pastors, go back to England. The way the pastors were paid in these days was by the crown. The government paid the clergy. So when the British left, the clergy has to leave. Now some of the clergy stays. Not all the clergy goes back to England, but a significant number do go. Well, the church, the parishioners There were some Tories, there were some loyalists that go back after the revolution, but not that many. A lot decide to stay. And so you got the Church of England here. What are you going to do with the congregations? Well, this is the beginning of the Episcopalian Church. The Episcopalian Church is what becomes of the remnant of the Church of England. So when all the money and when all the clergy left, they had to reform, and that's where we come up with the Episcopalian Church today. And they were strongest in the Tidewater area of Virginia and in some of the larger cities where the loyalist population, New York City had a loyalist population. That was another area. Now, over in England, the Anglican Church is also going through a little bit of a reformation. And that's where, go back to the Wesleys, this is the Wesleyan movement within the Church of England. So John Wesley, Charles Wesley, although John made one trip to the colonies, he was not like George Whitefield, who came many, many times and stayed for decades over here. Wesley stayed in England. But as the Church of England now was moving back to England, there were those people in the colonies who were followers of John Wesley in the Church of England when it was in the colonies. And so they go, well, we're not going to be like the Episcopalians over here. What's going to happen to us? So the war was over in 1781. 3 years later, this group of Methodists gathered in Baltimore for their first general conference. And as you know, the structure of our church, we're led by bishops. We don't have any of those over here. Anybody that would have potentially have qualified for that role are all back in England now. So what happens? So John Wesley ordains the first two bishops of what would become the Methodist Church, Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke. And the Methodist Church now is born in the U.S. because the British have left. The Revolutionary War and the outcome of it it extends beyond just our governance. It extends into how many of our churches got formed. And so all of this is coming together at the same time. We have an election, and our favorite of the day, George Washington, he becomes our first president. But I want to read for you some words from that point in time. If you've seen the movie, A Great Awakening, you hear about you see Benjamin Franklin, who is in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. He's there, and real quickly on Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was an inventor, very educated. He was a part of the Enlightenment and Reason movement. everything that happened in nature happened for a reason, and if you could just figure it out, you would know why it happened. He's this very reasoned individual. Everything has a reason. And as you saw in the film, if you saw that, I would recommend it if you haven't seen it. He develops a very close relationship with George Whitefield, this preacher of the gospel. And so they're at this critical point in 1787 in the summer where everyone's arguing it. It probably looks a lot like Washington looks today. No one could get along. Everybody had their idea on how the country should be governed. To move back to the Continental Congress of 1775 and 1776 in Philadelphia, we were only 6 or 7 years after the death of George Whitefield. And the country was just in this Christian fervor. And so all the delegates that came to Philadelphia in 1776, they opened every day's proceedings with prayer. That's 1776. By the time you get to 1787, just 11 years later, no one's praying. There are no prayers being said. And it's Benjamin Franklin that in more or less a conversation with George Washington, who is the president of the convention at the time, it is Benjamin Franklin, this enlightened person, this reasoned person. He's the one that says, remember what happened in 1776. Remember how when we were here in Independence Hall, we opened our proceedings every day with prayer. We have forgotten that. We have forgotten that. And he says, I implore this body to return to a time of prayer. They do, and 3 months later, all the parties come together, and we have our Constitution. So that is how George Whitefield has influenced even the Constitution 17 years after he died. Very, very important figure, this great awakening that took place. All right, I'll close tonight. I want to read to you George Washington's inaugural address, a portion of it, not the whole thing. This is in 1789. He's by far the most well-known, most beloved, most everything on the positive side person in America right now. And so he's given his inaugural address. It would be particularly improper to omit in this first official act. Okay, this is the first act of our American government. My fervent supplication to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. we ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained. The first official act of our country was that speech by George Washington. So to bookend today, I started with Christopher Columbus reflecting back on his journeys that brought him to North America. And here is George Washington wanting to set the course for this country. And for any of you who have started anything, you know that how you launch, how you establish, if you've ever started a company or whatever you have started, it's important how you establish the DNA of whatever this is that you're starting. And that's what George Washington is wanting to do with his first act. He wants to make sure that this Constitution that we have put together and these 13 colonies that have now signed on to it and have become a nation, they recognize that Britain is still out there and could at any day, and they know, and we know that, 30 years later, 20 years later, that we have our second War of Independence, known as the War of 1812. We know all of that's going on. What George Washington wants to focus on, it's not what will become our economy. It will not be what is going to be our military. It's not going to be many of the things that you would think a government would want to start with. George Washington wants everybody to understand that it's no accident that we're here. And as long as we remember why we're here and whose we are, we're going to be okay. And that's the course that he launched us on. Real quickly, for next week when we wrap up our 3-week series, I spent a lot of time on the Scotch-Irish today. And you might ask, how did that fit into today's talk? It's because that group is going to launch the second great awakening that's going to blow away the first great awakening. And so that's why I wanted you to have a firm understanding of who these Scotch-Irish are and the importance they're going to play in the presentation next week. Thank you. It's been a good evening, and we're right at 8 o'clock. And if anybody has any questions, want to hang around or whatever, I'll be here. But we'll be back next week. Thank you.